Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the impact that AI has on assessment. And we can start with some general things, because one of the main things that faculty have been concerned about, well, if you'd like a copy of these slides and a link to the resources which is contained in it, you can either type in that URL or just scan that QR code, which may or may not be blocked by this. Let me move this out of the way. Okay, so if you scan that, you can get your own copy of the slides. Or if you'd like, we can just send them to you later if you find them useful or not. And what I wanted to start with is the notion that people have been suddenly concerned about AI and cheating and how it enables cheating. But academic dishonesty is nothing really new. A survey that was done over, I think, a 15-year period or so found that 95% of high school students admitted to cheating at least once during high school. 64% reported doing it on a test. 58% reported some form of plagiarism. In 2020, among undergraduates, 32% reported, these are all self-reports, cheated on exams. 2% submitted another student's work as their own, 28% submitted joint work when individual work was required. And much of this was spurred by the movement to remote teaching during the pandemic and remote testing. And in general, self-reported cheating rates rose pretty substantially during the pandemic. That pre-COVID, the reported rate of cheating on online exams was roughly the same as on face-to-face exams at about 29.9%. After COVID, it rose to 54.7%, partly facilitated by the growth of businesses like Chegg and others whose business models were essentially devoted to facilitating online academic integrity violations. And we'll get more into the heart of this in just a second, but basically, traditional assessments are really vulnerable to AI tools that can do pretty well on multiple choice, short answer, and essay questions. Jump in.
Yeah. I was actually going to say, before we got to this part, as we're thinking about like academic integrity, I just read something like a summary of a study that was done through Stanford not that long ago, where they compared the levels of cheating pre and post, like the introduction of ChatGPT. And the levels of cheating really didn't change like very much at all, which I thought was really, really fascinating. It is something that is getting talked about like a whole bunch, but I do think that if we think about how we can apply those ideas to the assessments that we're giving our students, like I feel like more people are jumping on the bandwagon and making changes to the way that they assess students, given everything that's happened with it. So I do think that like we are as educators doing a good job in trying to like answer this challenge.
At least those people who are aware of the existence of AI
for sure.
And awareness and use of AI tools among faculty is substantially below that among students. So that is a bit of a source of concern. And if you are, for those who are listening to this later, if you want to test the vulnerability of your assessments to AI, just take one of your old tests and run it through and see how well it does. And you might be surprised at just how well it does on many types of assessments. What we're going to be focusing on today is mostly types of assessments that are not so vulnerable to AI tools. Just in terms of this, ChatGPT in its first year passed both bar and MBA exams in various cases. In economics, one of the things we noted very early was that if you ran through a standardized test of understanding and basic intro courses, which is used primarily to assess the impact of teaching changes in course structure with pre and post test versions. The TUS exam, as it's called, AI tools or ChatGPT 3 scored at the 99th percentile on the post test. So it did better than 99% of college students had up to that point. During the pandemic, cheating rates did go up quite a bit. But basically what's happened after that is we haven't seen, as Stephanie said, a change in the amount of academic integrity violations, but we've seen a shift so that students are more likely to rely on AI tools, partly because they can get at least the basic ones for free, while they had to pay $17 a month for Chegg. And in fact, there's a massive investor lawsuit going on right away that some of us were questioned about this summer, because SUNY has been queried about the impact of Chegg in terms of academic integrity violations across the SUNY system. And it's apparently they were claiming that they were primarily designed to support students' success during the pandemic, but in practice, they were mostly used by students submitting questions from their online exams for them and getting back responses, often within 5 to 15 minutes of the submission. And when AI tools became available, that pretty much stopped. Their profits have fallen, and that's why there's this massive investor lawsuit, class action suit right now. Okay, so what can we do? And one thing we could do, and this is going back to older ways, is we could just use in-class written exams. But one of the things, this is a good time to reevaluate what we're doing in terms of assessment. And if our goal is to prepare students to take exams in the future, that might be a really good strategy. But most students, after they leave college or after they leave grad school, won't be taking other exams. Certainly, they won't be working in multiple choice exams in the future.
And to jump in on that one also, one of the biggest issues with doing, like in-class written exams is like, if we're thinking about accessibility, then that becomes very problematic. So it's an option, but it's not a great option. And I mean, like from my field, I teach writing. It's really difficult for someone like me to really assess how much a student knows if I tell them to write like in an hour. You know what I mean? I'm a person who focuses very much on process and revision and drafting and like all of the parts. So for my field, especially, moving to an in-class exam is not ideal because it sort of contradicts all of the other things that I would be teaching my students throughout the semester. But accessibility was my big point for that one.
And neurodiverse students also face challenges. Issues of anxiety can be pretty substantial. There was a study done in North Carolina about a decade ago, actually, at the Duke University Talent Identification Program, where they gave teenagers the math SAT session. The math SAT, half of them took it under the usual conditions, and the other half took it without time limits. And one of the interesting things that happened is that the male-female grade differential disappeared when extended time was allowed. And part of the issue may be simply that females are more cautious and more risk averse and are less likely just to guess than males. So that was an interesting study that, again, suggests issues with time limitations on tests. And students process things at different rates. And that's not necessarily going to affect their productivity in the future, but it can certainly affect their success now.
So I'll talk a little bit, especially because, like in my classes and writing classes, we think about, I really try to emphasize the importance of process and thinking about how they're going to be developing skills that they're going to have later on beyond college. But even if we only focus on college, right, learning good writing skills is something that students will need to use in many of their college classes, right? So many college classes have some sort of writing component. It could be very, very small, right? Or like minor in the course, like responding to discussion board posts, or it could be really big. They might have to do papers in all sorts of different ways. So I think that really focusing on those sort of like small skills is really valuable. This summer I taught in the educational opportunity program, and many of the students who were in there, like, and I did lots of those small skill development things. So I had 2 class periods on like writing a summary, which is taught in high schools in many ways, right? But the students who were in my classes wanted even more of that, because they said, we're going to be reading so much throughout the rest of college. We're going to have to describe what we read, and just talk about it in a general way, write about it to help us understand, like you hear that whole writing to learn idea, right? And I think that, those sorts of skills are really, really valuable. We're emphasizing the importance of critical thinking now more than ever, given the changes with generative AI, right? Because it's a very handy tool. It can generate and produce a lot of stuff, but it still can't critically think for us. And the connection, I keep going back to writing, but that's what I do. The connection between writing and thinking is really, it's been, established for decades. So that's kind of like my big thing, is thinking about the process and showing students that like this is important, at least throughout the rest of your college career, but certainly as you move into your field of choice.
And it's important, especially in gen ed classes, that students don't always take as seriously or don't see the connection between what they're doing in their class and their future education or career goals, reminding them that these courses are required for some reason. In on Tuesday's class, in my large class with 260 students or so. One of the first things I did was a little poll asking them why they were there. And, there's some people said, I just really want to learn more about economics, but the majority of students were saying, it's in there because I have to be. It's required by the major. So then I raised the question, why is it required by your major? And, or with gen ed, you could ask, why does a college think that this is important for you to take these courses? And building a little bit of some discussion and a little bit of motivation by getting students to see that they're going to be learning something in the class that's going to have value beyond the exams that they take in the class can help motivate them to focus on learning rather than focusing on just getting the highest grade they can and jumping through the hoops with as little difficulty as possible. But we could also, and Stephanie's already talked about process, and that's true pretty much in all disciplines, that teaching them how to work in the discipline is probably more important than having them focus on getting the highest scores on exams or grades. But that effect of getting students to understand and better motivate the work that we do in our classes is probably going to be a whole lot easier if we rely on authentic assessments, where students can directly see the connection between what they're being assessed on in class and their future educational or career goals. So the first mention of this, I believe this is the first mention, was by Grant Wiggins in a chapter in a book that is a little hard to find, but in any case, he defines authentic assessment as one that is realistic, which means it corresponds to some real life activity that students might be doing, and they see the value of that. It should also require judgment and innovation, where they have to think critically and they have to do something other than just recall things they've learned in the past. It's asking them to do the subject. So, if you're teaching biology, have students do work that biologists do. If you're teaching economics, have them analyze problems the way economists would. If you have them writing, have them do writing assignments that seem authentic.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I have some examples of that. I'll probably wait until we go through the rest of this slide, and then I'll talk about an example of an authentic assessment that I use in one of my writing classes. And then that way I can do bullets.
Okay. Yeah, and basically replicating applications from that people expect to see in the future, because then they see the intrinsic value of the work, and then they recognize that these are skills that are going to be helpful and may help them get a job or perhaps keep their jobs in the future. And again, that these assessments do measure the student's ability to essentially negotiate and work through complex tasks. And also that students have lots of opportunities to practice, to try things out, to use resources and get feedback on and refine their performances and products. That shows up in pretty much all of the research on teaching and learning, that, if we really want to reduce equity gaps and achievement gaps and so forth, we really need to give students a chance to try things, practice them without penalty, and then develop those skills and getting feedback all the way through the process.
So one of the things that I do, or that I've done before, is I taught for several years a first year signature course, and those courses are designed for incoming freshman students. And the first year signature course that I taught was a spoken word poetry class. So I chose that topic because it not only engages students in, like the field of creative writing, but it also, the way that I designed the class was meant to help students practice things like communication, like practice verbally communicating, not only with one another, but with people outside of our classroom. I encourage them to think about their creativity. So we looked at examples of spoken word poems, but more importantly, they wrote them. They wrote their own, and the practice of just writing their own after they had writing prompts that connected to every assignment. Every assignment was also connected to who they are as a person. So it was meant to simulate what real spoken word poetry is, right? Because many of it is based off of the poet's particular life experience, their background, their feelings about things. So it was meant to do that, but it was also meant for them as first year college freshmen to think about who they were in that moment, in that semester, right? All of the assignments were very much grounded in that idea. So it sort of fulfilled the, let's think about who you are right now, but let's think about maybe where you want to go or who you want to be as you keep going. They all had practice writing their own poems, and their poems were graded based on completion. I said, did you do it? Yes or no, right? And if they did it and they turned it in when I asked them to turn it in, they got an A. And many of them, because they went into the class, it's a 100 level class, many of them, kind of liked the idea of writing, but were afraid of it. They told me after the fact that they really appreciated that they could write and they could practice. And just the act of writing was what could get them the grade. And then obviously we did more like throughout the semester, but all of the assignments, like I tried to put a lot of value on the act of doing, and the act of thinking through things that were very, very personal to them. And at the end of the course, right, as we had opportunities to practice, as I gave them chances to deliver their spoken word poems, their performance poems to their peers, right? At the end of the semester, they put on a performance that was open to the whole SUNY campus, and the community too. So they literally spent all semester kind of working toward this one goal. And for many of them at the end, they told me that they felt like they were more confident. They were more confident writers. They were more confident speakers. They felt like they could get up and, deliver something in front of a room. And that confidence for them was their really big takeaway. And that's what we had stressed sort of throughout the entire class. So in that class, it was the activity, but it was also connected to what I really wanted them to get out of it, which was more confidence for the future. And it worked out really nicely. It was a really fun class to teach. I taught it for 5 years. And every year, the results were the same in that way.
And another really nice thing about that is you're helping the students see connections between their own lived experiences, as you said, and the activity.
Yeah.
And that brings, that it's really important for inclusive teaching to bring in and celebrate the diversity of our student body and help all students make connections between what they're learning and their own lives. That's especially important in STEM fields where we don't do quite as well with that on average.
Yeah, that's what our the guy who came to the academic affairs retreat was talking about, the differences in STEM classes and some of the humanities classes that he had noticed.
So here we have a list of various things. Basically, these are all things where students get that pretty much can satisfy all those conditions of authentic assessment. Having students demonstrate something to the class or publicly doing something, as in that case. group projects relevant to the discipline. And it also makes it less likely that students will rely on AI as a substitute for learning when they're working with other people, because each person is expected to do some share of that work. And if they're not well, I found it much less likely in group projects, especially where there's individual accountability, that students will use AI, or if they do, it will be in ways that's agreed to within the class, at least based on my work, on what I've seen.
Yeah, to piggyback off the group projects also, I think relevant to the discipline is wonderful. I've also done group projects that are relevant to the community. So thinking about and trying to say to students up front, this is the purpose of this project. This is what we hope to achieve. And then this is your audience.
And that's on the next
that's on the next slide.
Yes. Community service projects of various types. Yeah. Yep. And they are intrinsically motivating, and that's kind of helpful. Empirical research, where they're doing their own research, they can't very easily just copy what someone else did if they're the only ones who's analyzed a particular data set or done some experiments. Open pedagogy, we could do a whole workshop on this, and we normally do a few of those every year. There's a whole variety of open pedagogy projects where you're creating something, where you're essentially creating educational content and sharing that publicly in some way. And I've had students write books, I've had students do podcasts, I've had students create videos that are shared with the class, sometimes beyond, etc. For student videos, one thing that people will often have college students do is create videos for the high school versions of those classes. So essentially they're explaining the concepts at a level appropriate for people initially studying that. And I've heard of cases of that in chemistry and biology and math in particular. And that can be really helpful because they see they're doing something that benefits other people, which is motivating. Role playing, if the role playing is realistic and meaningful, that can be a really good way of getting students engaged with the project. The reacting to the past series is a great set of role-playing scenarios that have been put together by volunteers throughout the world pretty much now, and they're available in pretty much all disciplines, where students are put in a historical situation and allowed to work their way through the debates where they take on a particular persona and they argue the points or make the points or engage in it from that perspective. And that helps them form a much stronger connection to the material than just reading a textbook or listening to a lecture or even watching a video on the topic.
The cool thing about a poster session, I think, is that you have the opportunity to not only put something together, so you have to be very, very intentional about what you put on your poster, but then you need to be ready to answer questions about it, right? And talk to people about it and elaborate more, or point people to resources. So I think poster sessions, I've done them in my classes as well. Or, obviously we have big things on campus like Quest and other things like that. But I love poster sessions because it gives students, the authority to kind of choose what they're going to put on there. But then also to make sure that they can explain it, right? That's one of the things we talk about in the tutoring center all the time, right? Okay, yes, the content, sure, but can you explain it, right? And that really shows that connection to higher level learning, being able to talk to somebody else or teach somebody else about a topic. So I think that that's a great example.
I forgot who said it, but there was a quote that if you can't explain something in terms your mother can understand, you don't really understand it, But yeah, poster sessions are great. I teach a class in econometrics where generally I used to have 30 to 40 students. Now it's about 25 to 30 students. And I used to have them do presentations with slideshows and so forth. And it was the most tedious experience for everyone, for the students while they were listening to other people do their work and they were anxious about it, and for me hearing the same sort of presentations on different topics, but the same presentations over and over again. I switched to poster sessions about 7 or 8 years ago, and it's been so much more fun and engaging for exactly the reason you mentioned, that instead of just being in front of the class for 10 minutes explaining what they did, they're spending the whole class period explaining it. And I break it down, so I do it still in at least a couple of days days. So half the class will be presenting one day, half will be doing it the other day. And then I usually have it in the classroom where people on one board will go and see the presentations of the others, and then they'll reverse that. So they all get to present to everyone else in the class. And again, spending an hour explaining it and answering questions from other people who've just been through a similar process is a much better and a much more fun experience. And again, and they have to understand the material in a way they wouldn't if they were just putting a slideshow together. Interview projects are another thing you know that many people do. I know certainly it's done a lot in comm studies. I get requests from those in that large class at least 10 or 15 times a semester because many students are taking an introductory thing and they've been asked to interview a professor, and it's a good project. You know, oral histories is another really good one, and there've been a lot of those. Many of them in history classes, but sometimes in other classes as well. Sometimes comm studies will do them, etc.
Cool community connections with the oral history one also, you know, which I think is so there's one project on campus that my colleague Eric Wade is working on in the English and Creative Writing department, and he's looking specifically at SUNY Oswego's LGBTQ plus history. And Maureen Curtin has been working with him a little bit also, and they've been going through the archives that Penfield has and contacting different people who were associated with different LGBTQ plus like movements or events or things that were happening on campus. And he's working to like uncover that history. So I went to a presentation that he did over the summer where they were talking about the different people that were interviewed and some of the different histories that have been uncovered. And it's just a fascinating project. And the cool thing about it is that, you know, for us, it's directly connected to where we are. You know, it's connected to Oswego. So I think that's really important stuff.
And along the same lines, community service projects, as you mentioned before, can be really good. Again, students work with some local organization or some group of organizations, you know, and they see the value of their work directly in the community. Another thing, you know, that's becoming increasingly popular is including the NACE competencies and course learning objectives and making those explicit. That's from the National Association of Colleges and Universities, where every year they survey businesses on what sort of skills they expect college graduates to have, and also whether college graduates have those skills. And there's a pretty big mismatch between the skills that businesses say they need and the level of skills that students come in. One of those is communication skills, one is writing, others are teamwork, others involve things like diversity, equity, and inclusion, because businesses are addressing those issues. And, you know, in the state of Florida, they may not be able to teach those issues, but, you know, addressing those issues is kind of important in somewhere in the college career, at least. And by directly including those and making that explicit in your class and making the connection between what you're doing and career competencies, again, increases motivation.
I feel like we were doing that for a little while, like in the humanities classes, you know, because for a little bit, you know, there are always conversations, right? Like you see the next like Forbes tag that says something like, are the humanities dead? You know, but I think it's just really good to see that, you know, skills like oral and written communication are still like pretty much at the top of the list.
And teamwork. And,
yeah. Yep. All of those sorts of like, so what we call soft skills are still incredibly important. And, you know, you can get those skills from many different situations, right? But like I like to think that in the humanities, especially, those skills are very much valued.
But if we can build them also into
Right.
the course and make it clear that the reason they're doing group projects is to develop their teamwork skills, for example, it motivates them in ways that just hearing about another group project might not motivate students quite as well. And if they know that the reason why they're working on writing is because that's going to be important later in their careers, that's kind of important, and et cetera. So, you know, connecting those things, making them explicit as learning objectives and explaining how they connect to course activities. It's really a good way of helping reduce some of the concerns about AI, because when students see that something is intrinsically valuable, they're much more likely to do it. You know, shortcuts are used when they don't value the work that they're doing and they don't see its meaning to them. And that's increasingly an important issue in general in surveys of students, that they don't see what they're doing in college as being connected to their own lives.
Yep. Or they run out of time, which is a whole other thing. But like some of the conversations that I've had with students over the last, like 6 months or so, anytime there have been questions about like academic integrity, one of the top answers that I get is I didn't manage my time the right way and I panicked. Which is a whole, like I said, a whole other thing, and I don't want to derail our presentation, but I agree with you that it's either lack of, they don't see the value, or there's something else going on that caused them to panic in that way.
Writing and performing a song is something as an option. You may not want all students to be required to do that, but if they could do that as one way of demonstrating their learning, that can be a lot of fun for the students and for the class. Create infographics projects are another thing students can do, which can be a fun way of representing a concept. And if they have to take a complex concept and distill it down into an infographic, they have to really know that topic well to be able to do that in a meaningful way. And if you're teaching a marketing class, an ad campaign might be a natural thing. If you're doing something on taxes, having students do community work with tax assistance for the community could be helpful. In computer science, give students some code that's defective in some way and ask them to try to figure it out. That's or let them write their own code and figure out why it's not working. Although AI can do a pretty good job now of troubleshooting code and correcting errors in code. Certainly poetry or short story collections, anthologies and things can be really interesting projects. And basically,
It's also maybe worth mentioning, even though I don't, I don't want to derail some, but thinking about also, like how, yes, like AI can do many of these things, but it can't do all of these things well at this time, right? So one of the things that I've done in my classes is like, okay, like let's look at something that AI has created, and then as a learning activity, have students, kind of like assess the quality of what AI has generated, So for poems and short stories, like, yeah, sure, it can do it, but it's a really interesting learning activity to kind of look at something that AI has generated and evaluate it, and then I think doing an activity like that sometimes can help students see, yes, okay, like it can be done, but I could probably do it better, and kind of emphasizing the importance of that in our classes, I think is important.
And we should note we're recording this on August 29th. Things may change by August 30th, 2024.
It's true.
But as of this point, there are some shortcomings in the output. But on the other hand, for many students, it could very well create C-level work, let's say, or maybe better in many classes. So, yeah. But yeah, if you really want to do higher level writing or higher level skills anywhere, AI is not quite there yet, but it's getting closer and closer pretty much every month, or at least in some ways. Yeah. So, some recommendations, to address what you do with AI in classes. We do need to prepare students for a world in which they will have access to AI tools, and they're going to become increasingly popular and increasingly more powerful along those lines. That we're seeing dramatic improvements, certainly every few months and sometimes every day at times. So talk to students about what types of AI use is appropriate in class, what would be ethical in class, and it's really good if perhaps you could have students co-create the guidelines and the rules on that, based on what you want students to get out and what students want to get out of the class, as well as how they may be using this in their discipline. If you're working in marketing, for example, as we have Mohammed Tashapur, he spends a lot of time teaching students how to use AI because it's already being used extensively in marketing purposes, and you need to prepare students to be working in that environment. In other disciplines, it's not used quite as much, but talk to students about how they see AI being used, and think about what's appropriate in terms of how we prepare them to live and work in that world.
Yep. I have the next bullet.
Okay.
So especially as we think about, like AI and writing, I think it's really interesting to talk with students about, how they feel about knowing whether AI was used to generate something or not, and I say AI in writing, the same thing could apply to AI in images, AI in music, really AI in most things, right? But I'm finding, and I'm biased, right, because I teach in a creative field, but like I'm finding that students have really strong feelings about AI and creative stuff and the creation of creative stuff. So like do we need to know that AI was used or how AI was used? Are there exceptions? Are there things that we just shouldn't use it for, like in order to be like a good human? So I was doing some general Googling, and I learned that there is an AI that is specifically created to write obituaries. Not just like using Chat GPT to write obituaries, but like there is an AI tool that was specifically created for that. And like people obviously have mixed feelings about that, so like is there a line? Should we know that an AI tool is doing something that we would expect a human to do? And asking our students, are there other instances where you feel like you would want to know? Think about giving feedback on assignments, you know what I mean? How I've had that conversation with my students. How would you feel if I generated feedback on your assignment, and you knew it wasn't coming from me? Like, how would that make you feel? So I think it's important to talk about this kind of stuff, and I think also that talking about these sorts of things and putting it in situations where they are more likely to understand the ethical implications. Like, yes, schoolwork is really important, but for some students, there are other things also that will stick with them a little bit more, right? So let's put it in context and really talk about it that way. I think it's very important. Speech done.
No, that's an important part of the conversation, and again, using a backwards design process where you clearly state what the course learning objectives are, create assessments that measure them in a way preferably connected to how they're going to be using them in the future, and then connect the learning activities to all of that so that students can clearly see the connection between what you're asking them to do and what you're hoping and what they presumably are hoping to get out of the class. That tilt approach is really useful, the transparency in learning and teaching, suggested by Marianne Winklemas and many others in various ways. And again, if you provide students with constructive feedback at each stage of the process, it's less likely they'll rely on AI, unless, of course, you ask them to use AI to generate some feedback and respond to it. And that's one of those conversations you can have, again, as Stephanie suggested. Well, what if I have AI do the grading of your work?
And I believe too that doing like one of the best ways to do authentic assessment is to give assignments in pieces or as part of a project or scaffold. That can be really, really helpful, because then students literally watch as they create a thing, and I think that can be very helpful, and it can also be a very handy way for instructors to sort of see everything develop, if you are very concerned about things like plagiarism and etc.
And students are most likely to engage in academic integrity when they get close to deadlines and they're desperate. And if you keep all the tasks small and you just require them to do something every week, or maybe a couple of things every week, it's much less likely that they'll rely on shortcuts because it's more manageable to them. And if you're giving them feedback, you can correct any concerns you have about the direction of the work early on, and so they can get pointed in the direction and make it clearer where they should be going. That's especially important for first-gen students. Now, this is where we break up into small groups in person, and we'll have some breakout rooms online to discuss what authentic assessments you've used in the past and what might you consider for future use. So we will stop sharing the screen on this screen. Okay, so Peter, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I'm a big proponent of authentic assessment, and I completely agree with what you've shared here, this idea that if we adjust the ways in which we're assessing students and also the structure of those assessments, we can avoid these issues related to academic integrity that many people are concerned with. Um, for instance, something that I do with students is like an interview, like you mentioned earlier, as a final exam. There's a list of 30 questions. Everybody knows what they are. The questions are asking students to connect concepts from the course to their personal experiences or professional experiences. So like an AI tool isn't that helpful to do that because the AI tool doesn't know their personal experiences or professional experiences. And so, yeah, students can ask 3 random questions from the list of 30. I get a very good sense of their ability to connect those concepts to their own experiences. And I can ask follow-up questions if it feels like a little like rehearsed or do you really understand the concept? I can ask some probing questions as well to make sure that there's a deeper understanding there that they should have by the end of the course. And so yeah, I think that there are absolutely ways that we can adapt to make this work. It's not the end of the world or anything like a lot of people often suggest, but it does take a little bit of thought. And um, authentic assessments are a great way forward. I completely agree with it. I think it's a good way to address concerns around AI tools and make sure that they're used constructively.
One of the things I started doing in my online class, actually before ChatGPT came out to the public, more in response to the increased student use of Chegg for assignments and essays and so forth, was a podcast assignment where they work with other students to help build connections, and they were a little intimidated by that in a number of ways, but they got to talk to other students, not quite in person, over Zoom or whatever, but again, it was a scaffolded project. They submitted a proposal. Well, first they picked what topics they were interested. They found partners. Then they submitted a proposal, and I gave them some feedback on that. And then they submitted either a detailed outline of what they were going to talk about, and or they submitted an actual script, and I gave them some feedback on that. Then they recorded. I gave them some feedback on that, and they could resubmit it as many times as they wanted. But they found that really, once they got past their initial fear, and by breaking it down into small chunks, it was pretty easy to get past that fear. In fact, the first thing I had them do was fill out a survey asking what concerns they had. And every year when I've done that, they've said, I don't know if I have the equipment or skills or know how to do this. And I said, well, I said, so the first thing you're going to do is, here's a list of some podcasts that tend to be like 5 to 10 minute episodes. Listen to one related to economics. And I said, listen to one of those and just record a 2 to 5 minute response to that using your smartphone or your Chromebook, listing some of the tools they could use. And they did that, and then uploaded into this up into a Google Dropbox. Back when we had Google Drive storage and so forth, space. But in any case, once they saw that they could do it, and you break it into small pieces that are manageable, it became so much more enjoyable. And for me, it was so much more fun listening to 20 or 30 podcasts than reading like 50 or 60 responses to a random, well, I gave them a mix of essay questions, but each student got a different mix of them. But still, it's so much more fun actually hearing the students' voices.
And I think students respond well to those types of assignments because they feel as though they're learning skills that will be useful to them moving forward. There's always that initial trepidation, but then once they get started and they actually do it, it's a very memorable thing for them because it builds their confidence and it builds their skills in new areas that they didn't have before. And I think it's really motivating for students once they get over that initial fear that you mentioned.
And another number of them went on to create their own podcasts on various topics, which was kind of nice to see. Because we certainly could always use more podcasts, or at least that's what the list of themes suggests.
I do love the strategy that you described though, Peter. I think that, like doing it that way and like giving them, okay, like here's the possibilities, right? And like they have those up front, which I think is incredibly helpful. Sure, like, it's 3 out of 30, but and the connection that you made between the content and their lives, I think is huge, and I think one of the things I've noticed is that our students, over the last, 5 to 8 years or so, they value that. They want that a lot. They want to know, okay, like, how does this matter to me? Right. What does this mean for me? So I think that's a wonderful way to go about that. And I'm totally going to kind of steal it.
Yeah, it's a luxury for me because I teach in higher ed and all the students are in higher ed. So they've had higher ed experiences and so it works really well. But when you're teaching a discipline that's a little bit more abstract, that's where those personal connections become more difficult for people. Not always. I mean, usually there is some sort of connection that can be made, but it's not quite as like readily open or available necessarily. Yeah.
Okay, any other thoughts?
No, I want to thank you both though for your time and all of the work that went into this. It's great to hear it. I was inspired by a few of the things you mentioned, and I'm gonna consider them for future courses.
Great. Well, thank you, and we appreciate you being here.
Thanks so
Because
much for
otherwise we'd just
coming.
be talking to ourselves.
Good to
Thank
see you both. Have a good one.
Yep,
Have a
you
good
too.
day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
And I'm going to stop the recording. Yes.